Hi class, it's Bill Berry here, and we're back in week 3 of our Java 2 course, and we are looking at a variety of topics that you're going to need for your upcoming project. These are things that are perhaps new to you, probably new to you. We're going to start with a small video on files and folders. In the project, you're going to need to write some code that will scan a folder for particular kinds of files, and so we want to look briefly at the code to do this. It really isn't that hard, so let's take a quick look at how that will work. First, the general process that you're going to do here is that you're going to create a file object. We're used to creating file objects for other purposes, like reading in data with a scanner, things like that. But in this case, you're going to create a file object that actually is going to point to a folder. It doesn't really care in the operating system which one it is, files and folders, whatever, you still create a file object, right? So you're going to create a file object and you're going to point it to whatever folder you're interested in. Then at that point you can use absolute pathing or relative pathing. As we're going to see, it's going to be very easy if you put the things in the same folder or in a subfolder as your project. That way you don't have to go through complicated pathing. Also remember, if you type in super complicated paths, that's going to ruin my ability to run your project, because on my system when I go to grade it, it's not going to be the same path, right? So we want to kind of avoid doing hard-coded long paths, but we'll be using just simple pathing. If you put the thing in the same folder as your project code, then generally that's good. Then the method that we're going to use on that particular file object is called list files. And list files says, hey, I want to enumerate all of the files that are in this particular folder. Now that also is going to return files and folders. Again, to the operating system, it's all part of the same thing. So it's going to return all of the files and folders, and it's going to return them as an array of file object references. So you're going to get an array of file objects back, and then you can deal with that as you want. One thing to check though is if it finds no files or subfolders, it's going to return null. So it's not going to return an array of 0 length, it's just going to return null. So that'll happen if the file doesn't exist or if there's no files in the folder, etc. And then you can do normal looping, right? You can just write a normal loop. For each loops, as I'll show you here, are pretty easy, right? They're pretty straightforward for this, but do whatever you need to do. And then the other point that is that you can do is you're going to have a method called isFile, right? And that's going to return true if the thing that you're looking at is a regular file, and isDirectory is going to return true if the thing that you're processing is a folder or a directory. So there's a reference here in case you want to know more about it, but that's really all we have to do to make it go. So let's take a quick peek at some examples. Let's first look at this particular thing. This is where my project lives, right? Here's my project file, here's my main.java file, and in this folder obviously I've got other things. I've created a sample folder just for us to look at. There's a file in there. There's another subfolder with another file. The contents of these are not significant. It's just the fact that they exist, right? So the point is I'm going to start with everything in this folder because then my code will have an easy time finding it without any pathing. So now let's bring up the BlueJ and let's start writing our main. All right, so what's the first thing that we're going to do in here? First, well, let me clear the screen because it's going to be a lot easier if I do that. I never like seeing old output and new output, then I get confused sometimes about what's going on. Now we're going to look at a variety of files, right? So let me start by creating a thing called folders to scan, a variable called that, and in it I'm going to create some stuff like a new file, and now I'm going to point that one just to have a sample. I'm going to point it to the BlueJ lib folder to just show you that there's a lot of files and we can return them all. Now one thing to remember is if you're on Windows, you're going to be using backslashes, but remember backslash is an escape character. So you have a couple of choices. You can double all of these, right? You can double all of your stuff, or you can just yield and say, hey, I'm going to use Unix style file names with forward slashes instead. If you do that, that's going to work on all systems. So I recommend that that's what you do. Right? So I'm going to create that, and then I'm going to make another new file, And I'm going to show you that you can do relative pathing, like you can just say dot. Dot means here, that's this folder. I'll show you another relative pathing option. You can use the name of the subfolder, and it's going to assume that's off of the current folder. And then I will, just to make sure that we try one of these, good for testing purposes, folder that does not exist, right? So then I'm going to stop this guy, and I'm going to put a semicolon, right? Now you might recognize that this is creating an array using literals, right? Using data rather than using the normal notation. So remember, you can do that in Java by simply enclosing the thing in curly braces and putting commas. Now it's complaining about file, of course, because it hasn't seen that. Import java.io.file, all right? So that will create a whole bunch of folder references that I can then loop through, right? So I'm going to write a loop that's going to go through each of these guys. First, I'm going to back way up here, and I'm going to say for file. Right, so I'm going to create a loop that's going to go through each of these things. Remember, for each loop, you put the name of the collection over here and the name or the data type of each element over here and create a loop variable to manage that. So for each one of those, I'm going to want to print out the folder name so that I can see it clearly. I'll use a printf to do that and say which folder I'm scanning, right? I'll substitute in a string representing that name. And one folder will automatically yield a toString that will cover that, right? So that way I'm going to be looking at each one of these, and then after I do that at the end, I'm going to do system.out.println, and I'm just going to print a whole bunch of these things so that I can clearly see the difference between the different folders that I'm scanning. Just to make sure I'm not completely off track, let's actually go back to BlueJ and let's run that. Just to make sure. I like to develop incrementally. Yep, okay, so everything's good there. Okay, so now we have our loop to do all the folders. Now within that, let's look for files within those folders. So let's go see what that looks like. So I'm going to create a result, right, for that. Right, I'm going to create a file array. That's the return type of this call that I'm going to make, which is going to be onefolder.listFiles. Right, that says, hey, for each of these folders that I'm looking at one by one, tell me a list of all the files that you have in you, which remember includes files and folders. That's going to be returned as an array of file references. Right, so then the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, don't forget that if you have a null value returned, that means you have no files and folders, right? So don't forget to check that, or otherwise you're going to get a null pointer reference when you try to dereference that and actually look at its contents. So in this case, I'm going to do system.out.println no files folders found. All right? No files or folders found. Now, I should actually see that working now. If I go back and I try to run this, remember, I've put in one thing that doesn't exist, right? So in this case, the folder's not gonna, it's not gonna find anything, right? So I do have those cases where I'm gonna have no folders found. So I just wanted to make sure that I was getting that in that proper case. So it is showing up in a little bit of a funny spot. So so I will certainly take care of that, and that's because I don't want to print that till I'm done. All right, I want to print that at the end. All right, so if you take a look at this code, hopefully that makes sense. So take a quick look, pause the video if you'd like to look at it more carefully. Okay, one error that I see is this is not programs files in Windows, right? This is program files. So let's take a quick peek. We'll fix that, and then we should see, sure enough, the only time that it says no files or folders found is when I made up a name of something that obviously doesn't exist, which is why we're trying that case. All right, so there you go. So now we have a good start. Now we have in our hands an array called folder contents that has all the files. So if it's not null, then we can go ahead with actually trying to display all of those file and folder contents. So again, we can loop through those things because now it's an array. We know the array is not null, so we can loop through them. So we can do something like this. Each one of these elements is a file, And the name of the collection, in this case the array that has the contents, is called folder contents, right? Again, always when a for each, you put the collection over here, then you put a colon to the left of it, and then you put the data type of each element and then give it a loop variable name. So now I can print out all the files, right? So I could, for instance, just print these out here, but I want to do a little more careful work here. So I want to say, for instance, if a file is a file, right? If it's a file, I want to do something special, right? So in this case, I'm going to say string type, right? So I'm going to say if it's a file, I'm going to say type equals file, right? Just so I can keep track of which is which. Else, if a file is directory, so if it's a directory, I'm going to remember the type of a file. Type equals, it's going to be a folder in this case, right? Now, the only problem is going to be, of course, that type, if I don't have an else, this may not have gotten initialized, so I'm just going to initialize it to nothing. So if there was anything that would be returned that wasn't a file or a folder, I don't think we're going to see that, but we have to do that or to make the compiler happy, because later we're going to want to print using that thing. Okay, so now I have decoded whether each particular element in the array is a file or a folder by putting a type in there that I can print. And now I can do system.out.printf, and again I'm going to do some little formatting. I'm going to put a string and then another string after a colon, and then I'm going to put a line feed, because remember printf doesn't do that automatically, and I'm going to substitute the type variable and then the file variable. All right. So stop and look at that code if you need to, but we're cycling through all of the files, or all the folders that were up here in our array. For each one, we're saying, hey, look at that folder, list all the files, store them. That's going to be in an array called folder contents. Of course, that array is going to be overwritten each time, right? New contents each time. Then, if there's no files, we're going to say there aren't any. Otherwise, we're going to decode. We're going to look at each one of those files, see whether it's a file or a folder, remember that in the variable, and then we're going to print that along with the actual file name so that we can see all of the contents here, right? So now I'm going to clean this up a little bit. I'm going to compile it to make sure everything is cool. I'm going to run it here, and let's see what we get. So let's go all the way back. All right, so here's our program files bluejlib, and it is a very busy folder. It has a lot of things. By the way, you will want to go in here, and if you want to change your BlueJ templates, you're going to want to go down into this area, and you'll find some stuff, some good stuff under there. Now let's go down a little more, and now if we scan the folder dot, remember dot means here, or I think of it as being me. So if you scan this folder, it's going to be the project folder. So of course, here's our source code, here's our bytecode, here's our project folder, and it tells you, hey, I've got some sample folders under me. Now, there's also some little temporary things that it saw that were sort of fleeting at that time that we won't see if we look at the folder, or maybe they're hidden, but those certainly came up too. Now, if I scan the sample folder, you'll notice that it does the README, and it also sees the sample folder. Now, notice it's not going to automatically recurse into those. If you wanted to crawl all of the folders and go all the way down, you would need to do some recursing, right? For every one of these that returned that it was a folder, not a file, you're probably going to make a recursive call to that to read that folder, so that you could really keep going all the way down if you wanted to crawl every folder, every file all the way down. So that is a quick look at how you can deal with files and folders. It's really not very hard. Again, the key is you make a file reference, right? You make a file object that points to the folder. You ask it to list the files that are in it. You get back an array that has both files and folders, and then you can loop through that to do whatever you need to do to those files. This is just an example where we're printing them all, and showing you some different examples based on relative and absolute pathing. So that's really all there is. You don't need to do anything else. You can also look at file extensions. that's something that you may want to think about for your particular project. So these files that come back, sometimes you want to look and see if the file name has a certain extension. If so, that's just part of the string. You can certainly look at them. All right, so thanks for watching this video, and we will move on to some other fun concepts in videos that are coming up soon. You'll see that, for instance, we're going to go, when we look at serialization, we'll look at collections, array lists. We got all sorts of fun things coming up soon. So thanks for watching this video, and hope to see you back for another one.